Hey, my name is Marius. I'm going to show you guys today how to create a simple full stack web app starter with Node.js and Express on the back end and React on the front end. I'll also show you guys how to set up your workflow for local development, as well as some tips to get your application deployed. Let's get right into it. Alright, step one, make sure you have Node.js installed. You can do that by going to nodejs.org, and then if you're not sure what to pick, just pick the current one. That will give you a lot of the most recent features. The installation, you go through that, it's pretty simple. Also make sure that you have a good text editor. Highly recommend VS Code. It's very good for JavaScript applications, in my opinion. And also I'll show you guys a couple of tips throughout this tutorial on how to set it up for effective development. Alright, step two, we're gonna initialize our front end using Create React App. This is a great place to start if you don't know how to set up a React application from scratch. It takes care of a lot of the boilerplate for you of setting up Babel and Webpack and all of that complex configuration. If you're completely new to React, it's my recommended way of getting started. So if you take a look at their getting started documentation, it's actually pretty straightforward. It'll tell you to use the npx command and then create React app and then the name of your application. Assuming you have a fairly newish version of Node.js installed, you should be able to use that npx command. It says here it comes with npm 5.2 or higher. Alright, so I'm gonna open up a terminal here. Make sure to navigate to wherever you want to save your project. In my case, I'm just gonna dump it in desktop for simplicity. Use npx create React app, and in the name of your application, I'm gonna call mine full stack starter. And then one thing to know here is if you have yarn installed, it will create React app will automatically try to use that to install the dependencies. I'm actually gonna force it to use npm just to avoid any confusion here. And there is a flag that you can use there to specify that. And I'll hit enter. And this should start installing my dependencies. Should be pretty quick. It could take a couple minutes depending on how fast your internet is. And we're gonna fast forward through this, and I'll show you guys what this looks like when it's done. Alright, now that it's done, you can see that it'll tell you that you can change directory to whatever name you gave it, and then you can run npm start just to give it a shot. And what they'll actually do is, it will spin up a local development server and automatically open up localhost 3000 on your browser, and you'll see your application run in there. We'll wait a couple seconds here, and there you go. From here, you might want to actually start opening up your application in VS Code. So there's Visual Studio Code. As you can see, Create React app will generate a couple basic files for you. There's the index.js, which is kind of the very root entry point of your application, and then there's the app component, which is like the top level component of the entire application. Couple of things I wanted to show here. One of the things that you can add to VS Code is this npm scripts toolbar, which will give you basically an easy way to access the scripts that you have in package.json. So remember, like for example, we typed in npm start in the terminal to start it up. Instead of you having to always type that up here, I can just click this play button and it'll do the same exact thing. So that'll save you, a couple seconds every time you have to start up the application. The way to turn that on is you can go to the settings and then search for npm, and then scroll down a little bit. There's an option here that says enable script explorer. Make sure you turn that on, and that will show this window over here. And then I also highly recommend, while we're in the settings, to turn on autosave. I usually do autosave after delay, and this is really handy. As you change your code, it'll automatically save your files, and then when it saves, Create React app will also automatically refresh the browser. So putting those together, very useful. For example, let's open up the browser here. Let's say we wanted to edit this text. It says this text is in app.js under the src or source folder. So opening up app.js on the left side here, maybe I want to change this text to hello world. Notice that it auto saved, and then it also auto refreshed the browser, and then we see our changes right away. Also delete this React link just to clean it up a little. Again, you'll notice that it's a very good workflow. You just make some changes and then your browser updates. That is phenomenal. And and I also wanted to mention, if you go in the Create React app documentation, I also highly recommend you set up prettier. This is a way to automatically format your code as you commit to GitHub or something like that, which is really nice. If you don't want to worry about tabs and spaces and all that, and you just want to worry about writing code, Prettier will do that. I'm not gonna go through the process of setting this up because it's actually very well documented. I highly recommend you check that out. Alright, so step 3, we're actually going to create a client folder here. It probably doesn't make a lot of sense right now, but remember that we're trying to put together both a backend application with Node and Express, as well as this client application that we just created. So you probably want to have a decent way to at least separate that code so that it doesn't get confusing. So we're going to put all of these client files in the client folder except for index.js. So we're going to go ahead and do that. Easy way to do this is shift click and just select all of these files except for index.js. And then make sure that you fix the imports in index.js, because it'll all be broken now because it's all in the client folder. So you see here it's importing the index CSS, so add /client there, as well as for the app and the service worker. Alright, and then once it all you notice that it's auto refreshing here, and you'll see that there's no errors anymore. You should be good to go. If you go in the browser, you'll be able to see the application again in local 3000. Alright, so we got a basic front end set up already. Let's then move over to the server side. Easy way to get started here is using Express's. They have their own generator, Express generator. It's just an npm package that you install globally, and then once you do that, you can then use the Express command to create a basic Node.js skeleton app. So we're gonna go and do that. What we want to do here is essentially create a server folder, and that's where I want Express to generate stuff. So we're gonna go change directory to src, and then we'll do express -- no view, And then I'm just gonna call this server, and let's see how that goes. And you'll see it creates a server folder which has a basic Node.js setup. So one thing to notice here on the server folder, that it has its own package.json. We actually want to go ahead and merge this with the one that we already have at the root level. So to do that, we're gonna copy and paste the dependencies down to the dependencies over here, and then on the terminal, make sure that you're back at the root directory, and make sure to do an npm install. That's because Express generator doesn't automatically do the installation for you like Create React app did. We're then going to copy over the server start script into the scripts here on the root package.json. And notice that we now have two start scripts. We're gonna rename the client 1 to client, and then also make sure to update the path here, because remember that file is inside src server bin. And then we should be good to delete this. From here, let's actually run npm start just to make sure it's working. A couple of things to notice here. Notice that it actually did start already, but it doesn't log anything. By default, it will run in localhost 3000. And you'll see a basic page like this. And this page is actually kind of useless to us. We don't really want the server to be serving this up. So let's actually change that. In the server folder, you'll see that there is a public folder where that's the thing that has the index.html in it, and that's basically spinning up the thing that you saw on your browser. We're just gonna delete that entire folder. And then in app.js, within the server folder, there is a line there that is doing express.static for the public folder. All that's doing is serving up the static files there. We're just gonna delete that. We don't actually need it. We also have to make sure to clean up index.js here under the routes folder. This is the route that was actually doing that logic to trigger the serving up index.html. We're just gonna update this to send a simple string. And you probably noticed by now that our server doesn't actually restart automatically when you make code changes. So at this point, it'll actually seem like if you go back to localhost 3000, it'll seem like it's broken because it's still expecting the old code to be there. And the only way to get around that for now is to restart your server. So if I click start there again and restart, go back here, refresh, you get your change. So that's kind of painful, so we're gonna fix that and introduce this thing called Nodemon. So let's get back to the code here. Let's close this running server and let's do npm install --save dev nodemon. Nodemon is just another npm package that allows you to automatically restart your node server when you make changes. So now that we have it installed, we'll actually create another npm script just for server local development. So let's call that server, and then we can actually start with what we have here. But the difference here is we're gonna change the node here to Nodemon. And then let's see what that does. Run your server script. Let's take a look at the application at localhost 3000, and then we're gonna do a change just to make sure it's working. So if I change this to hello, you see that it automatically restarts the server here, and when I refresh the browser, it's updated. You don't have to do any manual restarting. So that's pretty nice. So one other thing to add here, we'll close this again. Backend package.json. So the way it works with Nodemon is it'll watch for code changes. But we don't necessarily want it to watch for all of the code changes, because it doesn't care about the client folder, for example. So there is actually a flag that you can put in to specify where it's going to watch files. So it's -- watch, and then the location. In our case, we just want to watch any changes in the server folder. It'll restart the server. One last thing we have to add to this server script is a debug environment variable. You probably, like I mentioned earlier, when you run the server, you don't see some of the logs, even though if you, for example, open this www file, you'll see that it's using a logging library here, and there are places where it's supposed to be logging stuff out to the terminal. So for you to be able to see that, you have to actually, if I pull up the documentation here, it tells you to use a debug environment variable, and it differs a little bit based on what computer you're using, if you're on a Mac or Linux or no Windows. So to get around that, we're gonna use a library that allows us to set the environment variable regardless of what computer you have, and you can achieve that using cross-env. So let's do an npm install --save -dev cross-env. Once that's done, you can then do cross-env debug in capital letters, and then server, and this is kind of essentially saying print out to the terminal anything that is using server colon whatever. For example, here it's using the debug library with server. So now when we rerun the server script here, you'll start to notice that we now have additional logging output here, like the server listening on port 3000 that's coming from this www file I showed earlier. And then the only other thing we need to clean up here is notice that it's running this whole time in port 3000, which is the same port that the client tries to run in locally. So what we're gonna do is change the default port in this www file, look for the port configuration here, and change the default port here to be 3001. Going back into package.json, notice that we now have a server and a client npm script that we can use for local development. Now, let's assume that when you're developing, you want both of those running. You can, of course, run these separately, npm run server and then npm run client. But then that can get pretty painful very fast. So we're gonna install another thing. I promise this is the last thing we're gonna install. --save-dev npm-run-all. And what this package does is it allows you to run npm scripts either in parallel or sequentially. So we're gonna set up a dev script that is going to run server and client in parallel. So we're gonna do dev. I mean, you can do npm run all. There's a -p flag to specify that you want these to run in parallel, and then we can do server client. And actually there is an even shorter version of this. If you just do run -p, that's the shorthand. So running the dev command here, you'll notice that it will then try to spin up the server as well as the client all at the same time. Just like before, it's gonna spin up the client under localhost 3000, and then you'll also be able to see that the server is on 3001. So now they're both running in parallel. So let's review what we have so far. We made a couple npm scripts for local development. One of them was the client script, which when you run that, it spins up a local webpack dev server, which essentially what it does is it serves us our static assets like a JavaScript or CSS. So really our React client, and that makes it available on their localhost 3000. You'll be able to open up in your browser. The other thing we made was a server script which spins up our Node.js application, and it makes that available in localhost 3001. Now you might be wondering, how do you make these two guys communicate, right? You got the server and the front end. They're running in different ports. How do you make them talk to each other? You might think about, okay, can we use fetch? Can you make an API call from the client to the server, if we provided some kind of URL? And that's a good guess, but the problem here is that request will actually go to our webpack dev server, and we'll need a way to be able to proxy that request down to our Node.js server, as well as be able to send a response from the server back up to the client. Alright, so let's talk about how do we solve this proxying problem. Going back into VS Code here, in package.json, you can add a proxy property. This is something that actually comes from Create React app. When you provide a proxy property like that and an address, it will automatically do that proxying that we just talked about in the drawing. So you have to provide your server's address here, your local server address. You might also be wondering, why couldn't we just use the full server address in our fetch URLs? And the thing about that is there's two things that you'll run into. One is you'll run into this thing called coarse, which really is the browser is gonna complain to you because your client is trying to make a request that is at a different origin. You're going from localhost 3000 to 3001. So that's the problem you'll run into. And then second, when we actually deploy this application, to production, they'll actually be running as one application. It'll be the Node server serving up our static React build as if it was one application. It's not like two applications running like we have it locally. So you need to be able to have your client be able to request on a relative path, not a full address with the local host in it. So as we just mentioned, we'll want to set up our server to be able to serve up our static build of the client. And when I say static build, what I really mean by that is you'll see there's actually a build script here, and when we run that, you'll notice that when it finishes, it creates a build folder up here. And when you take a peek at it, what that really is it's our client's index.html, and then there's a static folder in there that has, you know, all the JavaScript bundled up, and also similarly our CSS. So we want our server to be able to serve up that static build. That's what we're talking about here. So to get started with that, we'll go into our server folder. There's an app.js there that has the Express configuration with the middlewares and such. If you remember, we deleted actually something here that was serving up static assets from a public folder. We're gonna bring that back actually, but instead we'll have it serve up our static assets in the build folder. So to do that, type in app.use and then express.static, and then the argument that you need to pass in here is a directory path, so we can reuse the path module here. And we wanted to be able to find our build folder a little bit farther out. Okay, so let's give that a shot. Let's run our server. When you go to localhost 3001, you should then be able to see your React application there, and notice that we're just running the server, right? We didn't run the client, so this is serving up the static build. So that looks good, but there's one last thing we need to configure here. If you decide to use client-side routing in the future, like React Router, for example, make sure that you're aware that there's a scenario where the setup that we have here will break without more configuration. So let's try to demonstrate the problem that we have here. I have the server running still, and it's serving up my static build in localhost 3001. Now, imagine that if we set up client-side routing like with React Router, and imagine that we set up some kind of path like /hello. If the user goes to, you know, your URL /hello, it'll show something on the client side. Now, when we do something like that and hit enter, when a browser refreshes, it's going to break. And why is that? It's because the server will see that route and assume that that's either an API route that we have defined here on the left, or it will try to see, is that a static asset? Now, both cases are wrong, and so then Express is like, I can't find this, can't get /hello. Essentially, it's returning us a 404 here, a 404 response. But the reality is, what you want it to happen is to kind of allow the server to just accept that path, render the UI, and then allow the UI client routing to take over and figure out what gets rendered under /hello. So the solution here really is we need to set up our server to take any path and always return our index.html, our client. So to fix this, what we're going to do is set up a route here that essentially accepts any path. So app.get, and then we'll do /star. That tells it to pretty much accept anything. And what we want to do here is respond with our index.html file that's under our build over here. So we can do res.send file, and then we should actually be able to reuse what we built here. So I'm gonna extract that and do put that over here. And over here, we'll do path.join or build path and look for index.html. And then over here in our express.static configuration, since we already have this guy over here serving up the index.html, we can actually configure this to only serve up the static assets but not the index by passing it in options object like that with index false. So let's see what happened in the browser. When we refresh /hello here, it's now bringing us back the client. And at this point, if you did have React router and you had a /hello route, it'll take over and then show you your /hello page. So we're basically good here. The only other thing that I usually like to do with applications like this is I make the server-side API be exposed under /API, the route /API. And you can see here, initially you'll have this /users route that Express.js gave you. So if you go to /users, for example, it responds with this string. And if you go into users.js, you'll see it doing that, respond with a resource. Usually, routes like this, I like to expose it under, /API/users. To do that, over here, I changed the app.use/ to app.use/API. And then I define all my additional modular routes within that. So for example, I can actually take this out. And in our index route, I can add that here. Make sure to import it. And then just change the app here to router. And you can delete this. So what that will do is now all of our APIs are under /API. So if I refresh /API/users on the right here, now it's being served up at that route. And then /API is just our base that we made before. That'll make it simple so that when you write the URL paths in your client-side code, it's always starting with that base /API. And we're done. That's it. This video ended up being much longer than I thought it would be. If you're wondering about how do you then deploy this application, it's pretty much the same as deploying any other Node.js application, depending on what platform you want to use, like Heroku or something like that. The only catch is you want to make sure that the client build folder is there by the time it deploys. So if you're using continuous integration, for example, you want to make sure that you add a task there to run npm run build before npm run start. That way when the server spins up, the build folder is there and it's able to expose your client to the browser. And that's it. If you have any questions, make sure to let me know in the comments. Otherwise, thanks for watching.